Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, dear colleagues. My name is Juliane Campfield. I'm the director here at Deutsches Haus at NYU, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to Bright Magic Stories, an evening of reading and a conversation between Damion Searls, the renowned translator who translated Bright Magic Stories, and Eric Banks, the director of the New York Institute for the Humanities at NYU. Before we start, as always, I would like to thank some individuals and institutions for making this evening possible. Of course, first and foremost, Damion for translating the book, and I should have said first and foremost, perhaps first, Alfred Döblin for writing it, but secondly, Damion for translating it, and Eric for being in conversation with him. I would like to thank the New York Review Books for publishing the book. The book just came out in October, and I would like to especially thank Nick Doring from New York Review Books, who is here tonight. And you can buy the book outside for, I forget, $17 something. This is the book. It's a paperback, and Greenlight Bookstore is out there selling it. So if you don't have it yet, get it on your way back. Also get some extra copies for your loved ones for the holidays. It's not terribly uplifting, but, you know, get it for them anyway. And another book that is on sale outside is Damion's short stories. So I haven't read your short stories, so I don't know if they're more uplifting. So maybe you want to buy both books to have a more uplifting and a less uplifting combination. Anyway, it's a little silly here. But having said that, I also would like to thank the German Academic Exchange Service for their support of our academic events. We couldn't do it without them. We're extremely grateful. I would like to welcome Alfred Döblin here. And don't get scared, I'm not a ghost conjurer. This is Alfred Döblin, not Döblin, and Alfred Döblin is the grandson of the author, and we're delighted to have him here tonight and to welcome him to Deutsches Haus. Thank you for coming. And another person to thank is Barbara Perlmutter, and I didn't really know that she also was involved in getting this off the ground at an earlier stage. So thank you for doing that, and thank you for being here tonight. You've done a great job over the years connecting people and bringing authors over to the United States. And last but not least, I would like to thank my colleague Sarah, our interns, our student workers, especially Gina and Luigi, who work here tirelessly to make all events happen, our photographer John, our videographers Laia and Isabel, and I would like to thank you, the audience, for continuing to come to all our cultural and academic events here at Deutsches Haus at NYU, and also for learning German if you don't know it yet. It's never too late. Even though some people in the audience like to speak German with an Austrian accent, and I will not look at anybody in specific, but that's okay too. Anyway, so I think I've thanked everybody, and I will now just briefly mention an upcoming event. In fact, our next event, the night before Election Day on Monday, and you can guess what that event will be about. It is a panel discussion among a group of people that we are co-organizing with the Center for European and Mediterranean Studies here at NYU, and we'll discuss this election, or whatever you want to call this current circus. But we'll talk about it. If you have time and aren't too tired about the ridiculousness of the last months, come join us and get drunk and talk about it. So it should be fun, I hope. Having said that, now let me read some very brief bios for our two distinguished speakers. Damion Searls has translated some 25 books by writers including Proust, Rilke, Jelinek, Walzer, Christa Wolf, Hermann Hesse, Modiano, and Jon Fosse. He's also the author of a book of short stories, I showed you that book, and The Inkblots, a forthcoming history of the Rorschach test, and biography of its creator, Hermann Rorschach. And now I have the third book to wave. I haven't messed up the order. This is the advanced reader's copy, and it's coming out on February 21st, 2017. So it might be a belated Valentine's Day gift. So there you go. I should also mention that Damion just received an NEA grant for the translation of the Alfred Döblin sci-fi novel that I think Döblin wrote in 1924, Berge, Meere und Giganten, Mountains, Seas and Giants. Another big Döblin adventure. So we'll hopefully do something when that comes out. And I should mention that New York Review Books is working on doing another Döblin, the wonderful and mostly known Berlin Alexanderplatz, which is currently being translated. So that will be very exciting, but probably will not come out until 2018. Eric Banks is the director of the New York Institute for the Humanities at NYU. Formerly a senior editor of Art Forum and editor-in-chief of Book Forum, Banks has contributed to a range of publications, including the New York Times Book Review, the Financial Times, Slate, the Wall Street Journal, Aperture, and the Chronicle of Higher Education. He has also served as an editorial consultant on numerous visual arts catalogs and collections of artist writings, including the Catalogue Raisonné of Ellsworth Kelly. And before we start, I just want to mention a few, not a few, but I just want to make a personal note about my thoughts on Alfred Döblin, which are unfortunately very much limited to Berlin Alexanderplatz, which made a huge impression on me when I was young, and I read it several times, and I just looked at my old copy last night and found all these notes, and it was such an, I would say, forming Lektüre, reading, that I think many people shared that, how should I put it, that experience. And I was quite impressed by reading Günter Grasse's foreword for Bright Magic, in which he thanks Döblin and really honors him as a teacher whom he had never known. And I don't want to put myself on the same level as Grasse because I don't write, but just in terms of impact. And I think for many German-speaking readers, Berlin Alexanderplatz had like a really momentous impact, and it is unfortunate that in a way, unfortunate that that book has overshadowed the rest of the oeuvre, which I think we should all try to rediscover, and I think that's what we'll do here tonight, and I'm so grateful we have a chance to do so, thanks to you guys. So please join me in welcoming Damion and Eric.
Well, I'll just say limited to, when you use that phrase, it certainly applies to, I think, most people who, certainly in the United States, when it comes to Döblin and his posthumous reputation. And it's quite appropriate that we're being stared at by the scowling face of Herr Fassbinder in the back of the room. So we can thank him, and thank him, I think, in a certain way for keeping Berlin Alexanderplatz alive for people, certainly outside of Germany, for people who know the book in a secondary way, and were introduced to the book probably through the television production. So it's an occasion, though, tonight to talk about Döblin before Berlin Alexanderplatz, and then after as well. It's an interesting thing about the collection that you've put together. It consists in two parts of early stories and late stories. And the early stories were published as an extant collection. It's his first published book in 1912, I believe. I don't know how many, I'm just curious to know how many of you are familiar with these stories in the German. Okay, good. A couple of people in the back, so maybe 7%, I would say, something like that. Okay. So good, this will be an interesting introduction, and I thought we could just begin, if you want to tell us a little bit about how Döblin came to be sort of the forgotten figure that unfortunately he presents himself to us today.
Thanks, yes. When I do readings from translations, I always have an ironclad rule of reading an excerpt or two first before any introduction, just so people know kind of who I'm talking about and what I'm talking about. But that rule has been broken tonight because there's no way to really convey what Döblin is all about. He is so extremely various. Some of the other books that we're not really going to get to tonight are a huge historical novel about the 30 Years' War, a trilogy about the conquistadors in the Amazon, a long verse epic poem about Hindu gods. There's a long novel set in ancient Babylon. There's the book you mentioned, the sci-fi dystopian epic of climate catastrophe, biotechnology, surveillance, mass migration, and artificial food production that goes to the 27th century. Then there is the sort of ripped from the headlines true crime book about two lesbians in Weimar Germany who murdered their husbands, or one of them successfully, one of them unsuccessfully tried to poison him. That came out the same year as Mountain Seas and Giants. So it's truly, in a way, the most important thing about him is that he's this volcano of extremely different kinds of writing. And that's just the content. I mean, I haven't said anything about the different kinds of styles in these different books.
And we could add also that he was a political essayist. He wrote quite a bit of did quite a bit of review work. He was a very active man of letters in addition to that, and he was also writing as a medical professional.
And an active politician, a political figure on the left, and a doctor, an early psychoanalyst, psychiatrist. When I was basically asked to read through his stories and see if I thought a selection of them should be published, what I ended up deciding to do was this sort of split collection that Eric mentioned, where there's these early expressionist stories, some from as early as 1904, and then there's a very big, I decided to do the whole first book because it hadn't been published before, because he didn't have kind of a identity as a short story writer, even in Germany that much, but certainly not in English. So Murder of a Buttercup was one story that some people had sort of heard of, and that was the title story of his first collection. So I decided for this sort of introductory selection to do the whole first book. Even if there were stories that I would have switched out for others I liked better, I decided it would be a better service to do the whole collection so people could see that. But then it really seemed unfair to the range of his stories to only do the expressionist ones, which are extremely powerful, but also extremely expressionist. There's kind of this icky body fixation. There's a lot of like double suicides. It has this supercharged power, but is also really in that mode that he himself quickly abandoned as he moved on to other projects. So in the second half of this book, along with a few other short, late things, the sort of centerpiece of the second half is, again, a whole book he published which consisted of two long stories called Bright Magic. And so the two sort of 50-page stories are in almost 40 years later. They're from when he's in exile in Los Angeles from the Nazis. And it has this very different humor and looseness and sort of almost Shaggy Dog quality. And so I didn't think it would be a sort of fair first selection to focus on either of those. And I mean, that's why I'm sort of saying this now, because I'm gonna, I think, read a bit from Murder the Buttercup and a bit from one of the late ones. But that's not touching on the weird, you know, Death Stalks 19th century Manhattan story, or the weird one about, you know, monsters melting Bluebeard's castle and all this other stuff. It's really quite an experience to sort of dig ever deeper into all these different modes.
Yeah. Just before we get into that, do you want to just give us a little bit more of a sense about his time in Germany? When he left, he went to Los Angeles, he returned. Just
I can do a little of that. I mean, I'm not a Döblin scholar.
No.
But he was, I can tell you the year he was born. It says so right here, 1878. So what's interesting about that is that even in the very early stories, he's still in his late 20s. And by the time he's doing Berlin Alexanderplatz, which is in the late 20s, he's 50. So he's not the, he managed to keep the firebrand young man energy very late. And so by the time he's writing these two long stories in the 40s, he's in his 60s. So he was a medical doctor. He was sort of radicalized by psychiatric patients before World War I. And then, you know, they often say radicalized in World War I, but he was already pushing 40 and had published this first book of expressionist short stories, had written another novel or two. And so he was sort of radicalized by his experience of seeing what World War I did to people, but it wasn't at the beginning of his career by any stretch. So he, the Günter Grass essay, which I chose to be the introduction to this book, is really great about sort of placing him in that sense, even though he's kind of unplaceable.
Yeah, I think that's a good, that's one of the real good things about this wonderful tribute that Grass wrote. And I guess it's become very much famous as the one sort of tremendous statement on behalf of Döblin's literary merits. It was Grass's, I guess it's a speech given on the 10th anniversary of his death in Berlin. And it's a really wonderful, sort of very concise statement about what's so special about Döblin.
So he was sort of an armchair world explorer. He actually, you know, wrote about the currents in the North Atlantic, about these ships sailing with the volcanic energy of Iceland to melt Greenland. But, you know, he never really left the library. And he probably wouldn't have if he hadn't had to. He had managed a travel book, Trip to Poland, in the 20s, which sort of previewed a lot of the anti-Semitic action going on there. But he ranged in his writing and in his mind. He was certainly not a world traveler. However, he was exiled, of course. Yeah. So he went first to Paris, ended up in Los Angeles as part of this emigre community, but sort of to one side of it as well. There are the superstars, Brecht, Thomas Mann, Heinrich Mann, Vicky Baum, and then, you know, there he was, and there's a sort of famous birthday party where the big shots try and raise some money for him, and he sort of acts strange, and it doesn't really work out. He then went back to Germany after the war, but didn't really find a place there either. He wasn't welcomed back in the West. He was sort of welcomed back in the East, but they didn't publish everything.
And all his books had been burned, except for Wallenstein.
So, so that's, if not the arc, at least those are the sort of two poles that mark this book. So the early experimental doctor, psychiatrist, young but not that young man, and then the much later exile, sort of letting it all hang out in these longer stories. That's sort of my sense of his career, which is not that of a biographer or an expert, but that's my picture of it.
I'm just going to quickly, because I do think it's a really nice tribute to him. Read a very tiny bit from what Gross had to say, and then I'm going to ask you to read a little bit to give us a flavor of a couple of the translations. Gross evokes the figure of Döblin sitting in the Bibliothèque Nationale reading while he's in exile in Paris, and he's actually set this up, and there was a Döblin converted to Catholicism, and Gross likes to blame Kierkegaard above all other figures for this. So he sort of set this up to talk about this kind of bomb that Kierkegaard had set ready to ignite at some point in Döblin's mind and soul. But he says, he talks about the effect of Kierkegaard sitting hiding somewhere in the Bibliothèque Nationale waiting for Döblin to read him, and he says, books' effects, even if often delayed for decades, must be at least intimated from the start, for we know very little about the effects of books, even less does the author know where his own words will fall. So I think that's a nice thing to think about tonight as we revisit his earliest writing and then a little bit of his latest writing. But there's a really nice passage where he talks about just the variety of productions by Döblin, and he says, so, a philanthrope and daydreamer, a productive crank, an active social democrat singing a hymn to mystical India in his free verse epic Manas. What else? He was a verbose despiser of art and a member of the Prussian Academy of Arts, an emancipated Jew and a Kierkegaardian Catholic, a sedentary Berliner and a restless armchair traveler until Nazi writers like Erwin Kolbenheier and Hans Grimm seized power along with Hitler, and he was driven out, set in motion against his will by the emigration. He returned home as a French officer with his last novel, the Hamlet novel, which no one in West Germany would publish. Only in 1956 did it come out in the GDR. How does this hackneyed saying go in the, quote, land of poets and thinkers, forgotten in his lifetime? Döblin just didn't sit right. He didn't come across. He was too Catholic for the progressive left, too anarchist for the Catholics, too lacking in concrete arguments for the moralists. He was too crude for late-night television, too vulgar for school radio. So I think that's a really great passage. And you've managed also to give us a real sense of just how varied the work is and how exciting it is to translate this massive novel, the sci-fi novel you'll soon be undertaking. But that's in the future, and let's point now back to what you've...
So here's a little from Murder of a Buttercup, probably the most classic early story, and then a bit from a later one called Materialism, a Fable. And this is the beginning of Murder of a Buttercup. At first, the gentleman in black had counted his footsteps, 1, 2, 3, up to 100 and back, as he climbed the wide, spruce-lined path to St. Ottilian and swung his hips to the right and the left with every movement, so violently that he sometimes stumbled, then he forgot. His light brown eyes, bulging in friendly fashion, stared at the ground, sliding away under his feet. His arms swung from his shoulders, making his white cuffs slip down halfway over his hands. When a yellow-red evening light between the tree trunks made him blink, he flinched his head. His hands made quick, disgusted, defensive movements. The thin walking stick in his right hand waved back and forth above the grass and flowers at the side of the road and disported with the blossoms. As the gentleman continued, calm and heedless, on his way, it got caught in the sparse weeds. The serious gentleman did not stop. He only pulled lightly on the handle as he kept walking, then turned back to look, wounded when his arm wouldn't move. Yanked in vain at first, then successfully freed the stick with both fists and, breathless, with 2 quick glances at the stick and the meadow, walked back so that the gold chain on his black vest jumped. The fat man stood there a moment, beside himself. His stiff hat was pushed back over his neck. He fixed his eyes on the overgrown flowers, only to lunge at them with stick upraised and face blood red, and beat wildly at the silent growth. Blows whipped left and right. Stems and leaves flew across the path. Puffing out air, eyes flashing, the gentleman walked on. The trees strode quickly past him. The gentleman was not paying attention to anything. He had an upturned nose and a flat, beardless face, an elderly child's face with a sweet little mouth. At a sharp curve in the uphill path, he had to pay attention. As he marched more calmly and irritably wiped the sweat from his nose with his hand, he felt that his face was totally contorted, that his chest was panting violently. The thought that someone might see him, maybe one of his business colleagues or a lady, terrified him. He rubbed his face and convinced himself with a furtive movement of the hand that it was smooth. He walked calmly. Why was he panting? He smiled, embarrassed. He had leapt at the flowers and slaughtered them with his walking stick, yes, struck with the same violent but well-aimed movements of the hand that he was accustomed to use to strike his apprentices when they did not deftly enough catch the flies in the office and present them to him, sorted by size. The serious man shook his head many times at the strange occurrence. The city is bad for the nerves. The city makes me nervous. He swayed his hips pensively, took off his stiff English hat, and fanned the fir-scented air, fir trees, F-I-R, fir-scented air onto his tufts of hair. After a short while, he was once again counting his steps. 1, 2, 3. One foot stepped ahead of the other, arms swung from his shoulders. Suddenly, Herr Michael Fischer saw, as his eyes roamed emptily over the side of the road, a stocky figure, himself, stepping back from the grass, lunging at the flowers, and slicing a buttercup's head clean off. What had earlier happened on the dark path was palpable before him. This flower here was exactly like the other one, down to the last detail. This one called to his eye, his hand, his stick. His arm went up, the stick whipped down. Whish! Off flew the head. The head somersaulted into the air and disappeared into the grass. The businessman's heart beat wildly. Now, the detached plant head sank awkwardly down and burrowed into the grass, deeper, ever deeper, down through the layer of grass into the soil. Now, it started to speed down into the center of the earth, where no hands could hold it anymore. And from above, from the stump of the body, it was dripping. White blood spurted from the neck and ran down into the hole, at first only a little, like the saliva running out of the corner of a paralyzed man's mouth. Then, in a thick current, slimy, with a yellow froth, it ran at Herr Michael, who tried in vain to get away, hopped to the left, hopped to the right, who tried to jump across it, whose feet it was already surging and beating against like the sea. I guess I'll stop there, but keeps going.
Well, the tale gets really addictive. It definitely does. And it actually has, I don't want to interrupt you before you read from the next story, but it has this kind of pacing that's just remarkable. I mean, the structure of the story is very pronounced in a way that one or two, I think it's rivaled only by one or two of the early stories, just in terms of how fantastically and well thought through and achieved the structure is for a story of this length.
You read it, and it's very clear to you this is a major piece of work.
Yeah.
I mean, when I was reading these to sort of decide whether to do them, I felt like I was reading Kafka that no one had translated and no one had heard of. I mean, it's just so obviously major. Even if it's not the kind of story you necessarily want to nestle up with your Valentine in front of the fireplace, it's obviously this major work. But now here, let me move to the
way that he gives this agency to the natural world. The way
everything. The trees are striding and his chest is panting like he's not panting.
No, it makes me think of Herzog.
Yeah.
I mean, Werner Herzog and the birds screaming in the Amazon.
So the two long stories at the end. One is called Traffic with the Beyond, and it's about a sort of spiritualist society in England that finally finds a guy who can sort of bring in the customers and the money. Then there's a murder in the town, and the police can't get anywhere. So they decide, well, why don't we just ask the dead guy who did it? And so it sort of starts from there, and it turns out that like one of the suspects actually knows the medium, and it just kind of keeps going. The other one is called Materialism, a Fable. And so what it's about is that word of the godless, soulless, mechanistic doctrines of humanity gets out. Some professors are careless and talk about it in front of their dogs. Some lab mice get away and sort of spread the news. And before long, news of this doctrine has made it out to nature. All the animals, the molecules, everybody learns that nothing means anything. The tiger thought he was being a tiger, but actually jumping after an antelope is just reflexes, so why bother? He turns vegetarian.
And becomes a gardener.
The waterfall, which was so proud of the rainbows and the spray and everything, it just H2O, why even bother? And it sort of dribbles off the cliff from then on. So for a while, everyone gets depressed, but then they realize that since nothing means anything, they can all just do whatever they want. And so it's the sort of anarchist phase of nature learning these new doctrines. And it just goes on and on. Like, you sort of think this is a one gag kind of story, but it's just stuff keeps happening. And so I'll read a little bit from the middle of that. Things were gearing up for a blockade of humankind. It got bad when the doctrine of materialism reached the cattle. It took them by storm, gaining ground effortlessly. And what did they do to profess their faith in it? Let us hear. They scoffed at heat. They lay as happy as you please in the cooking pot in boiling water as though taking a hot bath, and stayed raw. Then suddenly the meat turned hard as a rock and had to be thrown out. People took a new piece of meat, the same act, splashing in the warm bath, tough, then rock hard. If it had been considerate and still out to do something extravagant, it could have let itself liquefy. Then people could have enjoyed the beef as soup, bouillon, extract. Instead, it stayed hard and inedible. Let humans see what matter is. The housewives stormed the markets. They overran the butchers. Everyone said they had gotten the bad piece. But for everyone to have gotten the bad piece was, of course, impossible. Someone must have gotten the good piece. But who? There was no one who had, not even the butchers' wives. A single, piercing cry of protest ran out. It reached the ears of the old cattle, pig, etc. brotherhood, and was met with satisfaction and pride. Not a single brother had deserted. The animals, like the beef, had stayed firm. Panic seized the butchers. Housewives formed combat battalions and attacked and massacred the innocent butchers or forced them into their freezers. The butchers who survived or could save themselves ran out to the country, to the ranchers and stock breeders to take revenge on them. Met by manure pitchforks, they had no choice but to calm down and listen to what the ranchers had to say. The ranchers showed them their own broken teeth. The cattle were acting out against them, too. At that point, battles broke out in the cities for meat grinders and milling machines that could mill the meat. The army sent in military engineers to blow up the meat in the cattle yards with dynamite. That did break it into small enough pieces, but gave it a nasty dynamite flavor. There were fights over artificial dentures. Dentists worked in day and night shifts since everyone needed a new set of teeth every week. Dining rooms had to be furnished differently. Every place setting now included an anvil, and instead of a knife and fork, a hammer and saw to carve up the meat, electric in the better households. There are all these little nice touches, right? In Argentina, on the famously verdant pampas where large herds of cattle roam, people tried an amicable approach. Pueblo was the name of a kind old herdsman with a gigantic straw hat the size of a hut on his head. He was of Indian blood, and Arbel was the bull he had loved since childhood. The recent tension between man and cattle depressed the old man, and he was pleased when one day, around noon, as he was relaxing on the grass after his obviously vegetarian meal, Arbel the bull came up to him and mooed and looked deep into his eyes. "Pueblo," the bull said. "What is it, Arbel?" "Do you like me, Pueblo?" The bull seemed to be expecting a compliment. The herdsman glanced at his frugal orange peel, the remains of his lunch, and said, "Not much, to be honest, Arbel. We've had such problems with all of you." I see," Arbel smirked, acting as though he knew nothing about it. "Pueblo, your meat is inedible." "Oh," said Arbel, "impossible, what do you mean?" The good fellow was pretending to be hard of hearing. "Pueblo, none of you get tender when you're cooked. You break our teeth." "Oh," the bull mooed conceitedly. "Sorry to hear that. How long are you cooking it? Beef needs to be handled differently than lamb, you know." "We know that," harumphed the old herdsman in his hat hut. "You've all been kicking up such a fuss lately. You're acting bullheaded. Really, if it goes on like this, we'll just get rid of you. We'll go vegetarian." Pueblo concealed the fact that astounding things were afoot among the vegetables, too. The carrots, asparagus, cabbages, also the green beans. Humans were facing a total foodstuff blockade, so to speak. They'd really let themselves in for it with their theory. The bull was stunned and held his breath. "Proletarian? Rastafarian?" "Pueblo, vegetarian," I said. "Herbivore, plant eater, and we'll get rid of you." "What do you mean by that?" "The slaughterhouse. Cut our losses." You won't give us any more feed either?" "The slaughterhouse," Pueblo repeated, who loved the bull very much but saw no other way out. After this conversation, Arbel spent a bad night. In the morning, after his life partner, Hortense, an experienced cow, had been milked, lately, to make her job easier, she had been giving very watery, diluted milk, to which she also added peppermint flavoring. Arbel went up to her in the stall and told her what he had heard from Pueblo. He mooed familiarly. "We can't go on like this, Hortense, my love. The humans want to turn Rastafarian. They'll slaughter us." "Let them turn Rastafarian, and they slaughter us anyway, if that's all they've got." Arbel: "You smell like peppermint, Hortense, my little doodlebug, buttercup, honey bunch, baby cakes. You're brushing and flossing too much. It'll get into your milk. Who'd want to drink that?" "Don't meddle in my grooming, Arbel," she mooed back. "I love peppermint. It's good for your breath and for the teeth." "But what about the children? The suckling babies?" cried the tender-hearted bull. Hortense waved her tail contemptuously and drove away some flies. So Arbel hung his head and sadly reported the failure of his efforts back to Pueblo. The herdsman had expected as much. Hortense had already produced pure buttermilk the week before, and a few days ago, milk with herring flavor. She didn't care. How she came up with herring was a mystery, but Hortense was capricious, coquettish, and knew how to talk people into anything. Just one more. "They won't give up their freedom," Pueblo reported back to his boss, the cattle rancher. "Times have changed. Looks bad for us. They'll starve us." The boss laughed at him, called him a fool. They put engineers and inventors to work in the recalcitrant cattle battle, building machines that could reduce meat to dust. Adding water turned it into a gluey paste. It could be swallowed dry, but then people couldn't open their mouths once more and had to be drilled open. The housewives revolted again. They rushed to the engineers' laboratories, bringing the new powder with them, scattered it in front of the laboratories' doors and in the windows, then poured water on it. The gentlemen were trapped, hoist with their lack of petard, and had to save themselves via the chimneys. The whole campaign had achieved nothing. And since more and more of the vegetables were on strike too, the situation grew quite alarming.
That reminds me of my favorite two-line poem by Howard Nemeroff called Bacon and Eggs. And it goes, "The chicken contributes, but the pig gives his all."
And that made me actually look up hoist with my own petard, which we all know, but like, what's a petard? It turns out a petard is a small explosive for blowing open an opening in a wall or a door. So it's really, and he uses petard there, and it's obviously a Shakespeare reference in there too, which is why I sort of insisted over the copy editor's objections that it had to be not hoisted and stuff like that.
But hoisted is just wrong.
So that's what a petard is. And so those scientists who were like sealed into their labs with this meat paste glue mortar really did need a petard. So they were hoisted with their lack of petard. Like, it's actually right.
Mm-hmm. What is it like to deal with the language I mean, it's such a difference there's so much more irony and playfulness that emerges in the late stories. And, as a translator, Döblin is famously a difficult case when it comes to translation. Brilliant Alexanderplatz is one of the most notoriously poorly translated books of canonical status from German in the 20th century. And people have all so frequently talked about how difficult it is to render into English. What is it like how is the language as playful as, I assume it's a fun language to work with when you're dealing with the later stories?
Yeah, so first let's not blame Döblin for the bad translation of Berlin Alexanderplatz. That's the translator's fault.
No, that's what I'm saying. But I'm saying it's difficult.
Right, and so when people talk about him being hard to translate, there are a couple of different things they mean, one of which is true and one of which isn't really that true. So there is a lot of local slang and stuff that to any German reader says Berliner. And dialect always is a translation issue because you don't want to turn it into like Philadelphia English or Birmingham English. You can't like transplant it that way because that doesn't make any sense. And so so dialect in particular is something that always gets not lost, but you just have to recreate the effect in other ways. So if you are getting this kind of colloquial energy, then you just have to get colloquial energy in another way and not through dialect. So that's the only bit of Döblin that I would say it really is sort of untranslatable, but not really, because you just have to get it out in another way. Yeah. In terms of the wordplay, the harumphing herdsman's hat hut and stuff like that, it's lucky that German is a lot closer to English than a lot of other languages. So like hat and hut are alliterative in both languages. But basically, you just have to get the tone, and if you can't get a pun in one place, you get it somewhere else. Mm-hmm. And there's a story about one of Borges's translators who was translating a rhymed sonnet, and the final rhyme word is Walt Whitman, and it just like wasn't working because the words don't rhyme in English. So he's trying, and he runs into Borges on the street in Buenos Aires and sort of is complaining about how hard it is. Borges raises his hand, says, "You just have to try harder." Yeah. There's that. So you're right that the two styles, the sort of expressionist, like crazy psychedelic animistic one, and this kind of ironic, playful one, read very differently. But I didn't have that different an experience translating each half of the book because, you're following him, and when he's doing some weird thing, you're just trying to do the same thing.
Did you feel, this is maybe a way to redirect that question, because it's something we were talking about earlier, is the question of continuity between the two halves and between relatively early Döblin, certainly early in his publishing career, and very late by his terms. Did you feel you were reading the same writer?
Yeah, if that's a yes or no question, I'd say the answer is no, and that's why I tried to put both of those writers into the same book, because Döblin the person is both those writers as well as 15 others. Yeah. I mean, I go back to those sort of, Pueblo and Arbol is funny. Like, you want to reread that kind of stuff maybe more than you'd want to read some of the earlier ones or reread some of the earlier ones, but the earlier ones are so powerful. And we were talking about the first story in the book called The Sailboat Ride, which just has incomparable language and creating this sort of musical imagery for you.
Yeah, and he hits this repetition of a few key sentences that occur midway at a very dramatic point in the story where the Brazilian commits suicide or is swept over.
Spoiler!
Yeah. Well, I think.
Spoiler, they all commit suicide. No, just kidding.
Yeah, I don't think I'm giving that much away. But when the scene more or less repeats itself with the
girlfriend.
metamorphosis at the end,
Yeah.
which I think is a good word to use in that context. It's very, very much the exact same wording, and he does that throughout a lot of the early stories. I mean, when we were talking earlier, I think you compared it. It does have an aspect of being a tone poem, and the language feels, in most cases, extremely precise, given the very atmospheric effect that he's trying to go for. It's a weird thing about reading the early stories that you get these really precise details. A person's name living in the year before the war between the states. I think you called it the war between the states, it used a very Southern expression to describe the Civil War, which I was surprised to see.
The New York story sort of is explicitly right before the Civil War, so that all the crazy stuff that happens kind of gets forgotten a few years later because other stuff has come along.
Yeah, but it's named. It gives you extremely precise details in a New York that's clearly of his imagination. It reads like Kafka's America. I mean, it just makes no sense whatsoever. And some of the other stories are very much like that, with these extremely exact sort of descriptions, details. This took place at this place in time, and it was a story that everyone in New York knew in 1860. The fairy tales are even that way in a certain way. I mean, there are really two that are very much fairy tales, and then there's a story that we were discussing earlier too, called the Immaculate Conception, which is not, in fact, the Immaculate Conception, but that's sort of at odds with this very atmospheric sort of sense that I think he's trying to achieve in the stories, and that I think he succeeds in very, very well.
I mean, there's one of the sort of famous slogans of his, which is the poetry of facts. Yeah. This kind of very research intensive grounding in reality and also science that then gets put in the service of this imagination. But I mean, that slogan, as Günter Grass would remind us, is from 10 years later than these stories, and he changed his mind and he refutes himself. And so you can kind of find at various points in his output pretty much anything about pretty much anything, because he is just, one of the other famous lines is that early on he's doing this futurist stuff, and so the futurists like him. Then he publishes a manifesto that says, or a letter, sorry, that kind of rejects futurism and says, I don't want to hear just trum, trum, ta, 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 50 times over. That doesn't require any great mastery of language. You tend to your futurism, I'll tend to my Döblinism.
Obviously, Döblin had to leave Germany, and he went to France, as you told us about, and then he went to the US. And I'm just wondering, and I'm not quite sure if you would know that, but do you feel that there was an influence of being in the French language then and then being in the English language on his writing? Did being surrounded by these other languages as opposed to being in the German language, did that have an influence on his style in any way?
I had never noticed that or suspected it, and now that you ask and I'm thinking about it, I'm inclined to guess no. I mean, first of all, he would have been 60 and pretty set in his ways, although I've just been saying the opposite, so busted. But yeah, I think that he explored and read around all the way through. I don't really sense the way that, you know, when Rilke moved to Switzerland, he started writing in French and things happened to his German and other sort of exiles. Yeah, that doesn't strike me as really applying to him. Although, again, I'm not a scholar or expert, so I wouldn't be the best person to definitively answer that.
Did he read, do you know if he read books in translation, or if he would read the books in French or in English when he was in France or in the US? And perhaps that is also a question for you, if you happen to know that, Alfred.
I think all that I'm aware of is that he was very frustrated in Los Angeles, because I don't know what his English level was, but it certainly was not at the speed of his, obviously, what he could do in German or in France. And I think he even describes it in Destiny's Journey, that there was a frustration that people would assume he was illiterate in Hollywood because he wasn't speaking with the same kind of rapidity and that mental speed in English that he would in German. So all I know from my father and my uncle is that it was a very unhappy experience in that sense in Los Angeles. He was not a happy person at all in LA, Catholicism aside.
Saved, but not happy.
To follow up on your comment that that if you were pushed to an answer, you had the feeling that there were two writers in this book, and my experience of Berlin Alexanderplatz is that it's a different writer completely. So I have a two-part question, and that is, where on the arc of his writing and of his style does the science fiction novel fit? Is it like a fourth writer? And so when you were doing these stories in particular, and perhaps when you do the science fiction novel, do you approach it differently, or is it just like any translation work that you do, each project has its own voice and you go with that?
Yeah, I mean, Berlin Alexanderplatz is different from the two things you heard, and the science fiction one is different, and then there's the free verse Hindu mythology epic.
Is the science fiction book as radically different as, say, these two stories are?
It kind of is. So it's in this style that's foreshadowed by the title, which is missing the commas in the list that you'd expect. He does this thing where he does strings of, it's sort of a sheets of sound Coltrane kind of thing, where he'll give all the verbs or all the nouns just in a row with no commas. So, I mean, I can't like make it up off the top of my head, but he'll, instead of having a sentence with a verb, he'll have a sentence with four verbs that are all the same part of speech and parallel to each other, but not separated with commas or and or anything like that. He'll just sort of give all of them. And the thing about that is that it's modernist and experimental, but really easy for readers today to handle, because basically it's like a Twitter feed. You're just getting the we're used to getting sort of separate parallel blips of stuff and just sort of putting it together ourselves. So I think at the time it was seen as a bit more difficult than I actually think it is now. But yeah, that's different. I mean, that doesn't come up in the other stuff I've read. And that's what I was trying to say at the beginning, that it's not just in the subject matter. He really is reinventing everything each time. It's kind of crazy. To the other part of your question, I think it's just like anything else as a translator, different project. You're trying to do the same thing. You're trying to read in a sort of deep way to get at what you think is the core of it. And you just sort of gerrymander the important stuff away from the unimportant stuff, and then you preserve the important stuff. You try to write like the important stuff you've read. So if you know, dialect always gets gerrymandered out because you're never going to be able to do that. But if there's a pun on like the herdsman's hat hut, then you decide as a translator, this is something I need to figure out a way to get across, or you decide that it isn't. And I mean, that's what you're doing. So, so there's no like radically different experience of translating the different Döblins any more than there's a like radically different experience of translating different authors in my experience.
Do you think in Tales of a Long Night, he's combining the early and the late? Because you have those long stories that are so much like, in many ways, the construction of the short stories in the first part of is it a way that he's actually looking to combine his early and his later periods into one sort of seamless work?
That sounds very convincing, but I haven't actually read that one. So
Okay.
I don't know. Do you?
No, I don't know. I couldn't answer.
Sorry.
I cannot speak to that at
I'll
all.
ask you another time.
To be continued.
Did you have
Yeah, I have a question. Thank you. The last time we had a Döblin event here, which I was trying to remember when it was, maybe 8 years ago or 10 years ago, his son was here. So I don't know if you knew if his son was still living.
Well, it wouldn't have been 10 years ago, because my dad died in '94. He lived in New York, Peter. My other uncles, I mean, my Uncle Stephen has been to New York occasionally, but if there was something with my father, it would have had to be pre-1994.
And I want to congratulate you, firstly, Damion, on the extraordinary work that you've done here on the translation. And I need to do so before getting to the question, because otherwise it would just sound absolutely rude. You're not doing Berlin Alexanderplatz, is that right? So who's
Michael Hoffman.
Okay, and that's
It's in good hands.
Okay. I was just curious.
This book was a bit delayed, and Berlin Alexanderplatz is taking a while too. My understanding is late 17 or sometime in 18 is when it'll come out. And there was a sort of strategizing question of, would it be better to publish the two things simultaneously, or sort of have one be a kind of teaser for the other? And between the different translators' paces and the publisher's own decisions, they decided to do the story one first. So on the one hand, everyone will be excited when there's a new Berlin Alexanderplatz. On the other hand, this is new material. So
It makes complete sense, whether it was utterly arbitrary or not. I think it makes complete sense to have the stories which have, until now never been available in English, right?
which is so shocking.
Yeah.
Well, yes, thank you not only for the brilliant translation, but also for being able to read like that from it. That is a rare gift, I must say.
Noah, you spoiled everyone. Now everyone has to. Now everyone has to say the nice thing first.
We rehearsed this before you arrived in the room, so don't worry.
We did. Well, I do have a question, but before I ask it, I want to say something about literary tradition, which is maybe by accident and maybe not, but my name is Ulf Erdmann Ziegler. I came in as a writer in residence just a few days ago, and actually I hadn't expected that, but in Darmstadt there was a eulogy spoken about my last novel, which is an Orlando novel, and the one who did it was Wilfried F. Schöller, and Schöller is the biographer of Döblin, right? His biography came out about 3 years ago. It's Schöller's opus magnum, and that connection just came to me right now. Isn't that strange? My question is as to dictionaries that you use. I mean, many young people are totally convinced that they don't need them, and actually many people, not only young people, don't even have them anymore. They just throw them out. And they just look up everything on Leo or wherever. And I wonder if, I'm convinced this is not you, but I wonder if you need dictionaries of that time to get to the core. I picked up a Wagner's, I think, a school Wagner's of 1924 here in the streets about 25 years ago. And that helped me to this day to understand certain things in American English that are not in newer dictionaries. So that would be my question to you.
So I thought you were asking something else. In terms of German dictionaries from the time, that in fact is what the internet is kind of good for. You know, not necessarily the translation sites, but the whole Grimm's dictionary and sort of all of these other regional dictionaries are available. There's also the question of English dictionaries. So if I'm translating German to English, and I'm glad you asked that because it's a little bit of a bête noire of mine. There's sort of this idea that a lot of people have, but I don't know that anyone's really justified or sort of thought through that if I'm translating a novel from 1850, I should only use words that were in English in 1850. And in a certain sense, sure, you don't want to talk about someone pimping out their iPhone if you're translating, you know, Green Henry or something. But I actually think that there's no reason for that. In other words, nobody's speaking English in my 1850s German novel either. I'm translating it into 21st century English for 21st century English authors. So if someone's a nice guy, do I need to go and do this research to figure out whether guy was a word in English in 1850? Why does that matter? If it's too contemporary, that's a problem. But there's no rule book that says I'm not allowed to use it. So for Döblin, especially, or not necessarily Döblin especially, but for any writer who's just this kind of free, I don't think that there's a need to have that kind of pedantic, anti-anachronistic fetish about the language, because nobody's going to be reading my translation in 1927 anyway. So that's the question I thought you were asking, which might not be the question you were asking at all.
No, but you're free to answer in any way. Thank you.
Maybe one more if there's anyone.
Well, I want to thank you all. It's a terrific audience, and thank you so much for the conversation.
Thank
this
you,
is really
everybody.
a marvelous translation. It's really wonderful to read, and congratulations on it. And I hope you'll all purchase a copy on the way out.
Thank you, Damion. Thank you, Eric. Thank you for coming.